let me ask you a question. What's your opinion on Sonic the Hedgehog? Chances are the answers to that question are more varied and inconclusive than my payment history, but really, what do you think of the blue blur? Your thoughts are most likely heavily dependent on how you experience the character and the world he inhabits, because there have been more interpretations of Sonic than layoffs at Ubisoft. Well, alright, that's a topic for another day. But the point is, from gameplay to story, from characters to world building, Sonic the Hedgehog has just been so inconsistent. Now, don't get me wrong, there is an overarching plot and world to Sonic's games. It's just that certain elements of it get overlooked within specific games. Why is he here? Why is he here? But don't even get me started on the movies, shows, and comics, which have had dozens of different interpretations of Sonic's world. I mean, watch Sonic Underground, Sonic Prime, and then the live-action movies and explain to me how they could all possibly take place in the same universe. Go on, do it! Now, obviously, these are all different stories in different canons that are not supposed to be linked together, but generally speaking, all these different stories can be confusing to a general audience. Plus, it leaves people with different impressions of what Sonic means to them. Someone whose only exposure to Sonic is Sonic SatAM would have a very different opinion and especially understanding of the franchise than someone who's only experienced Sonic 06. And both of those names I just listed aren't even the official names of those pieces of media. Those are just what fans refer to them as to differentiate them, because in actuality, both of these are just called Sonic the Hedgehog. No subtitle or nothing. At least Sonic Colors is safe. Wait. No, one subtitle was enough! One is enough! But of all these different interpretations, the one that's been the most inconsistent in literally every way is the games, which makes sense, of course, that's where Sonic started off, but it sucks because the thing is, it doesn't have to be this way. Sonic has had a pretty consistent story throughout the years, but what makes it confusing is how the games seem ashamed of themselves. I mean, after the debacle that was Sonic 06, it seemed as though everything just came to a halt, and since then, while steps have been made to get the story back on track, nothing in the series has been quite as clear since, nor are any of the games we're getting now willing to delve into some of the weirder parts of the lore. But as I'm sure you can tell by now, this has recently changed completely due to the most recent game in the Sonic series. And ironically enough, it's not even a game about Sonic himself. That's right, baby! Shadow the motherfucking Hedgehog! What?! Now, one thing I've neglected to mention up until this video is that, yes, the allegations are true. I am a Sonic fan. I grew up with Sonic Unleashed and Sonic Colors on my Wii. I was raised by that low-resolution hedgehog, okay?
This is my estate. I'm fine for Ford and a future ride. We all gotta start from somewhere. It's worked out for me. It's possibility. From never where did I see it? I see it. Now it's all for me. It's possibility.
I carried around a frickin' werehog action figure with me everywhere I went. I had Sonic Underground DVDs, I watched Sonic X when it aired, and yes, I was terrified of Sonic.exe when that game got made, and yes, it did make me stay away from the franchise for like a year or so because I was 6 years old and Sonic had bloody eyes, okay? But growing up in this era of the franchise meant that I didn't have much interaction with Shadow as a character. I knew that he existed, and yes, I of course had an action figure of him, because even baby me had good taste, but I didn't really know what he was outside of Sonic X. Oh, and Sonic and the Black Knight. You guys ever play that game? It's pretty good. But man, to me, Shadow was just Sonic but with a gun and a motorcycle. Or rather, the cooler Sonic. But of course, as I grew older and I continued to make poor life decisions, I stuck with the franchise and revisited other games from across the series. So of course, it didn't take me very long to understand the story of Sonic Adventure 2, and by extension, the character of Shadow. The story that they just forgot about? Like, I'm sorry, you give him a good character arc in 06 and then just go,
I don't want to play with you anymore.
He didn't appear in Unleashed, he didn't pop up in Colors, and then when we get to Generations, what does he say? "You got this, Sonic?" Then the next time we see him after that, he's just bullying some random guy so his likeness could be used in a war? What has become of my goat? Shadow just sort of didn't do anything in the Sonic canon for a while there, until just last year, which was dubbed the Fearless Year of Shadow, in which we were promised his appearance in the next Sonic movie, and a side mode featuring him in a remaster of Sonic Generations dubbed Sonic X Shadow Generations. Or at least that's what it looked like. Just some sort of side mode. Nothing insane. Yeah, guys, Shadow Generations is just a flat-out brand new game. And not just that, it's a whole entire love letter to the character of Shadow, and by extension, the lore of Sonic's world. This game's identity hinges on embracing and examining Shadow's past, and I think this method of storytelling, going forward, could be an amazing way to reignite the Sonic story, especially considering how well-received this game has been. So, what is Sonic X Shadow Generations? Well, it's a collection of 2 games, a remaster of Sonic Generations, and of course the all-new Shadow Generations. The Sonic side of things remains almost entirely the same, aside from a good bit of dialogue changes to make the story of Generations make sense within the context of the whole Sonic universe and not just the limited view that we had at the time of the game's initial release. Because remember, Generations released directly after Colors. Sonic Team wasn't really interested in calling attention to anything beyond the basics. But in this remaster, we get actual references to other parts of the canon, which is a nice touch. I know some line changes are controversial, but generally speaking, I don't mind the dialogue at all. It's really just a preference thing. Gameplay-wise, modern Sonic plays exactly the same, while classic Sonic is virtually identical with the inclusion of the drop dash from Sonic Mania and Sonic Forces. Unfortunately, the drop dash in this game just felt finicky to control. I had some fun with it, but it most certainly wasn't as intuitively implemented into the game design as it was in Mania. It felt more like its implementation in Forces, which caused me to not really want to use the move at all. Regardless, it's a nice addition, and it was certainly more useful here than it was in Origins, am I right? Other than that, it's just Sonic Generations. It's pretty freaking good for the most part, except for when it's really not.
Hey Sonic! Enjoy your future! It's gonna be great!
Shadow Generations, on the other hand, goes in a whole different direction. So let's talk about that. The rest of this video will be an analysis of the story of Shadow Generations. If you wish to remain spoiler-free, now is the time to click off. You have been warned. The game starts off right where Sonic Generations starts, although this time we see Shadow's perspective. He's missing the birthday party because he's too busy dealing with a supposed threat on the Space Colony arc. It doesn't take very long to figure out that this threat is the return of Black Doom, the main antagonist of Shadow's solo game from the early 2000s. There's actually a recap of Shadow's story up to this point available on the title screen for people unaware of the character's past. But even so, for those of you who don't know, basically what you need to understand is that Black Doom is the ruler of an alien army, the Black Arms, and Shadow is technically one of them since he was created with the DNA of Black Doom. Okay, now that I'm saying all of that out loud, I'm starting to realize why Sonic Team wanted to ignore the lore. Anywho, after beating Space Colony Arc Act 1, Peak by the way, Shadow is brought into White Space by the Time Eater and the game truly begins. The first area of the game contains 2 levels, Space Colony Arc and Rail Canyon from Sonic Adventure 2 and Sonic Heroes respectively. Aside from how incredibly fun these levels are, they hold significance for Shadow as a character. For one thing, the Space Colony arc represents all of Shadow's past, from his creation to Maria's death. This place represents who he was, who he is, and the events that shaped his entire motivation as a character. It's fitting that the game begins here, because if we're going to take a journey through Shadow's past, then it makes sense to start where his life began. It's interesting to note that this is also the only place he visits on his own terms outside of White Space, and of course, this is where he enters White Space. Obviously, there was no better level to start this game, but what I think is incredibly interesting is the choice of the second level. Rail Canyon is from Sonic Heroes, and isn't necessarily a very memorable level on its own, but it's interesting to consider what this level means in the context of Shadow's past. In the Dark story, Rail Canyon directly follows the first conversation the team has with Eggman, leading Shadow to question his identity. For context, one of Shadow's big character motivations in Sonic Heroes is figuring out whether or not he's the original Shadow or a Shadow android created by Eggman after the original Shadow died. He figures out at the end of his own game that he is in fact the original Shadow, and he didn't die at the end of SA2, But what's relevant about this is the fact that it's right before Rail Canyon that Shadow starts to question who he is, and it's during this stage when Shadow first verbalizes these doubts. So it makes sense that the first location he visits in Whitespace would be representative of this struggle with his identity. It's also important to note that the 3 characters Shadow runs into in this section of the game are all robots made by Eggman who have gone off on their own at some point in the past, representing what Shadow was afraid of being. Especially considering that while Shadow isn't a robot, he was not born naturally either. He was created using the DNA of Black Doom by Gerald Robotnik in order to become the ultimate life form and to cure Maria's illness. So no matter what version of Shadow he turned out to be, he would always be a creation of the Robotnik family in order to serve their own purposes, selfish or not. And of course, this is represented even further by the boss of this area, the Bio-Lizard. The Bio-Lizard was the prototype of the ultimate life form, which was designated to stop anyone attempting to stop the Eclipse Cannon on the Ark. In the original version of this boss fight, Shadow fought the Bio-Lizard in order to stop this weapon, and by extension, reject his creator's plans, no matter how much he cared about Gerald, and even further, how much he wanted to let this happen to avenge Maria. But in the end, he chose the right thing over what he felt the world deserved. This boss fight is representative of that. The Bio-Lizard is Shadow, or at least his prototypes. So in this sense, he's fighting himself, but symbolically, he's not just fighting what he was meant to be, but who he once was. Right after the fight, Black Doom reveals his true intentions of using Shadow as essentially a vessel for world domination, as he intends to take control of him using the Black Arm's blood in his veins, which of course Shadow intends to prevent. Moving into the second area, we start to see a bit more of Shadow's past. If Area 1 was about Shadow's identity, Area 2 is about how others perceive him. The levels in this area are Kingdom Valley and Sunset Heights from Sonic 06 and Sonic Forces respectively. They can be played in either order, but I'll talk about Kingdom Valley first just to keep with timeline order. Kingdom Valley was a level in Sonic 06 with not much of note happening story-wise. However, the location itself, lore-wise, represents the ruins of an ancient civilization before eventually being abandoned by the royal family of Selenia. Is this relevant to the topic at hand? No, not really, but it's all I could really find in the location. What's important to note here is what happens at the end of this stage. When Mephiles is set free from the scepter, Mephiles immediately takes the form of Shadow, so an objectively evil character copies the likeness of Shadow, because that's what he's seen as, especially considering how Shadow presents himself in this era of the franchise. It makes sense that he may be seen as a villain rather than the anti-hero he more accurately represents. This can of course be seen further in the next stage, Sunset Heights. Let's not forget what Sunset Heights means to Shadow, because not only has he been to this location before, but it's also the place where his likeness was yet again used for nefarious purposes, this time by the Phantom Ruby and Infinite. Recall that at the end of one of the Sunset Heights levels in Sonic Forces, Shadow takes down a Phantom Ruby version of himself and explains to Sonic what's really going on, signaling to the player and to Sonic what Shadow's true intentions in this game are. Of course it made no sense that he would be on Infinite's side, just like it makes no sense why any of the other villains from Sonic's past would suddenly reappear. It's almost as if this wasn't planned to make sense or be a good story, and Sonic Team just wanted an excuse to advertise this game with all of Sonic's past nemesis coming back, despite the fact that this plot point quite literally never amounts to anything. Anyway, the point is that this location is yet another that represents who Shadow is, but more specifically the distinction between who he is and how others perceive him. And this is made all the more apparent after completing the level.
Thank you, Shadow.
Where did you learn to fight like that?
They must be from a point in time before the Ark disaster. Perhaps I can change their fate.
Shadow? You look grim. Are you alright?
I'll be fine. We'll all be fine. Find somewhere safe to hide. I'll take care of everything.
With Whitespace being able to take locations and memories from Shadow's past, it always stood to reason that he could see Maria and Gerald again through this game. But it doesn't make the reveal any less impactful, because suddenly, Shadow isn't just on a quest to stop Black Doom, but he realizes that he has the ability to change the past. He could save his family. The boss of this area is Metal Overlord from Sonic Heroes, the version of Metal Sonic who went rogue, impersonated his creator, and set out with the goal to become the one true Sonic. What's important to note about this character is what he represents, especially compared to Shadow's story. Metal Sonic is a robot made with the express purpose of copying Sonic, just like Shadow once feared he might be. But even if he isn't, this is still a hedgehog created by a Robotnik in the image of Sonic, intentional or otherwise, and notice what Overlord says to Shadow throughout the fight. He calls himself the king of all creation and exclaims that no one can stop him, and especially not an imposter like you. Does that sound familiar to anyone else? This isn't even mentioning the fact that Metal can also use Chaos Control against you, a power that stereotypically only Shadow was able to use. Metal is Shadow, not in the same way that the Bio Lizard was, but rather in the way that others perceive Shadow. I think the best way to prove this point is to just flat out quote directly what he says.
You can't hope to defeat me, except for making a hedgehog. I am now the true Sonic, the true ultimate life form.
Don't.
I think it's pretty cut and dry exactly what the game is trying to present here, using the fake Hedgehog line directly referencing Sonic Adventure 2, and even calling himself the ultimate life form, directly connecting himself to Shadow. After beating the boss, we have yet another conversation with Maria and Gerald, in which Gerald reveals to Shadow how he was created. Of course, Shadow already knows this. He learned about this way after Gerald's death from Black Doom himself, but of course these versions of Maria and Gerald are from a time before everything. To them, Shadow is still just a kid. So he puts on an act. Or maybe he doesn't. Maybe hearing those words come directly from Gerald make him truly accept the reality of his situation and the circumstances of his birth. It's no longer just a baseless claim from an alien emperor, but a stone-cold fact in the mind of Shadow. We, as the player, already knew this, but maybe Shadow refused to believe it. Perhaps that's why he acts so surprised here. The third area contains only one level, Chaos Island from Sonic Frontiers. I don't really know what to say here. I mean, Shadow wasn't in Frontiers at all. He's never been to this place before, so I think this is the first and only real example of a level that's just here for the sake of being here in Shadow Generations. It's a fun level and all, but yeah, it really doesn't connect much to Shadow as a character, unfortunately. But it's after this level that we get to see Shadow's perspective of the rival fight in Sonic Generations, which is when we see that he actually gave Sonic a fake emerald, which is a nice touch. The boss of this area is Mephiles the Dark, which is a character I've already talked about earlier in the video, but all my points about him still stand. Mephiles is Shadow, more so than any of the other bosses in this game so far, at least in appearance. Mephiles formed himself around Shadow's appearance. He is literally the physical manifestation of Shadow's shadow. He's shadowing Shadow by being his shadow, thus foreshadowing Shadow's story in Shadow Generations. Shit. I think by now it's pretty clear what's going on in this game. All of these bosses, in a sense, are Shadow. Shadow is going through his past, fighting what he was meant to be, what he could have been, and what he's perceived as, before capping the game off by rejecting yet another person who wants to control who he is. After the third boss fight, the climax of the game begins, with Black Doom finally truly confronting Shadow, leading us to the final level and boss. But not before, honestly, one of the most heartfelt scenes in the entire franchise.
Professor, what do you think he means he learned from our last encounter?
I surmise you defeated him at some point in the future. He has grown a new body and used the nebulous nature of time in white space to accelerate his plans for revenge.
He's right. No more mistakes. This time, I will crush every last one of them.
Shadow, no!
Maria?
It breaks my heart to see you so full of anger. This isn't who you are. Do you know why I named you Shadow? Because without light, there's only darkness. But a shadow will show you where to find the light. Do you understand? I don't want you to be driven by darkness. I want you to be happy. Stand in the light with peace in your heart.
A lot of the information in this game has been stuff we already knew, with the main important part of it just being the fact that Sega is finally taking Shadow's backstory seriously. But this is completely new. This is the first time in the whole Sonic canon where we've been told directly exactly how Shadow got his name, with it finally being revealed that Maria named him. Is this scene a little cheesy? A bit cringe? Sure. Yeah, it probably is, but what the fuck did you expect? It's a game about a talking hedgehog made with alien DNA. It's not like this line was out of the blue. The final level is Radical Highway, which has been teased throughout the entire game, with many previous levels being morphed into Radical Highway by Black Doom near the end of them. But now we have a full level, which of course represents a lot in terms of Shadow's past. Radical Highway is the first full level Shadow has in Sonic Adventure 2. This was his debut level, the beginning of his character arc for the player. This is where Shadow first mentions Maria in the original game, where he promises vengeance to her. So Shadow's return to Radical Highway is symbolic in the sense that his character has come full circle from who he was at the time, while also being a parallel to that original scene, as he's made yet another promise to Maria. A promise that he can't keep. For her sake. The final boss is Devil Doom. Taken directly from Shadow's solo game, this boss takes elements from every single mechanic that the game has thrown at us, all of which being contextualized as Doom abilities. He uses Black Doom's powers against him, fighting fire with fire. The boss caps off with the background track changing to All Hail Shadow by Crush 40, which was his main theme from Sonic Adventure 2. However, I personally think that I Am All of Me would have fit this scene far better. After all, this game is about who Shadow is, how others see him, and who he wants to be. I Am All of Me was the main theme of his own game and represented his identity crisis perfectly, and I still think it perfectly encapsulates who Shadow is as a character. Shadow is someone haunted by the past, and by all of the people who have tried to make him something he isn't. Even the very circumstances of his birth were manufactured to fit a specific purpose. No one has ever asked Shadow what he wants out of his life. He had to figure out on his own who he was. Black-hearted evil or brave-hearted hero? He came to terms with his identity a long time ago, and yet even still, simply because of the blood in his veins, he's tormented by people constantly trying to use him as a weapon. As great of a song as All Hail Shadow is, I think for the personal journey that Shadow went on in this game, I Am All of Me would have fit much better, and if Sega won't do it, then goddammit, I will. One step forward, two steps back, I'm here. Can you see all of me? Walk into my mystery, step inside, hold on for dear life. Do you remember me? Capture you, set you free. I am all of me. Here we go. When Black Doom is finally defeated, White Space begins to return everything back to its original point in time, including Gerald and Maria.
Shadow? I knew you could do it.
Maria!
I'm okay. Really.
Professor, what's happening?
Without Black Doom's influence, the time anomaly is beginning to heal. We are returning to our own point in time.
I'll stop Rouge. Use Chaos Control. Stop this moment in time.
Shadow? No. I don't want to be frozen in one place in time. Besides, your friends need your help.
But you don't know what's going to happen.
I'll see you again. And if fate draws us apart, I will
Shadow Generations is a return to form for Sonic lore. It's the first time in a long time that Shadow as a character and the story that surrounds him has genuinely been taken seriously. Plus, on top of all its callbacks, it gives more story to Shadow, more character motivation, and more of a concrete identity. With how well this game has been doing, it only makes sense for Sonic Team to do more stuff like this, to truly expand the lore and world of Sonic. And I, for one, am incredibly excited to see what they do with this. Shadow Generations took a franchise that was dormant and embarrassed of itself and reignited that spark that made people fall in love with the stories of these games in the first place.